Welcome back, I'm that chemist, and today we have a story where somebody reused chloroform, but there happened to be Phosgene in it. When an article says, some scientists think, then I remember this. I, a scientist, once thought I could fit a whole orange in my mouth. I could, it turns out, get it in there. But I hadn't given sufficient thought to the reverse operation. I saw this tweet and I had to include it as Chempilation, it's just so great. In German high school, 12th and final year, we were supposed to shoot a video for new students who would potentially join the school, 4th class. One experiment was pouring ethanol into a large metal tray, igniting it, then blowing magnesium powder from a glass rod into the fire. This whole demonstration was done in a fume hood. Our teacher told the guy who blew the magnesium into the flame to not put too much into the rod. He absolutely loaded that thing, and the result was a temporarily blinding, around 1 cubic meter large, fireball. Luckily, no one got hurt. In the same class, I once somehow got hydrochloric acid in my eyes. I don't know how, although I wore safety glasses. No problem, because we had an eye wash station, which the teacher immediately used. Turns out there was a hole somewhere in the hose, which unbeknownst to me, flooded the room next door, which was used for the storage of chemicals. Fun times. Oh no, that's awful. I hope your eyesight was okay. This highlights the importance of having an eye wash station available just in case crap hits the fan. Also, a fun forestry story. One of our main washout classes is Tree ID. There are 140 plants you have to learn in the fall, so leaves are not a strong strategy. There are a couple of plants with strong odors, so smelling a crushed up leaf or another plant is one of the ID methods. I remember on our third week, some people were trying that with poison ivy, putting it right up to their noses. This being the third week, it was also the first week the professor wasn't warning us about ivy, mainly because he was in this case quizzing us on it, and you can be giving away questions. I guess they learned which plants were which that day. I'm not a chemist, but I want to become an analog photographer, and I've dabbled in it for about 6 years now, with me being 19. When I was 14 or 15, I was in my improvised darkroom in the woodworking workshop, in my stepdad's cellar. I was setting up chemicals in the tray, and when it came to the stop bath, I decided to just eyeball it and squirt some stop concentrate directly into the tray, as I wanted to be fast, and with the stop bath, the extract concentration isn't so important. I used some Alma Loco S10 concentrate, which is basically just citric acid. Problem was that the bottle in which the concentrate was had a little cap on it with a little hole so you can only squirt a little at a time. With me being impatient and stupid, I decided to squeeze the ever-living daylights out of the bottle, and the cap shot off the bottle, spewing a bunch of the concentrate directly into my left eye. Panicked, I dropped the bottle, started to run a few meters, came back to see the bottle upright so I didn't lose any more of the stuff, and then ran upstairs to the bathroom where I cleaned out my eye for about 10 minutes. My eye was a bit red, but I felt fine. The next day, I asked my chemistry teacher in class, and she said that if I don't feel anything, I should be fine. I'd like to say that I learned my lesson, but PPE in darkrooms is usually a miss, with people often touching chemicals without gloves, and most home darkrooms not having proper ventilation. In my now proper private darkroom, I'm often naked because of how hot it can get. In my now proper private darkroom, I'm often naked because of how hot it can get with the big Soviet 1000-watt print dryer in the same room. Make sure your PP has PPE. Today's Yikes awardee is Manny18. Sadly, simple mistakes can be costly. I had my own share of that when I dropped a gallium-68 generator. It produces gallium-68 from decaying germanium-68, which is then used for PET scans. Hospitals that cannot afford a massive and expensive cyclotron can buy these instead, if I understand the product correctly. This box is of course basically one big block of lead to shield for outgoing radiation, and when transferring it to the storage, one slipped out of my hands, tilted in flight so one of the rounded edges caught my foot at the top and it slides down my foot like a slide on the playground. My foot wasn't hurt, and the way down wasn't all that high, but you cannot open it up and just look to see if it's broken. Neither is it a good idea to test it in operation 100 times, because the risk of it malfunctioning at the customer's end is simply too great. $100,000 down the drain. That is so awful to hear. Even though you caught it with your foot, it still isn't a $100,000 boo-boo. That sucks so much. The last story happens during a course, which was basically Intro Organic Chemistry for Babies. We were doing some demo, which I don't recall, which released sulfur dioxide. I have a history of asthma, but back then I was pretty sure that I had it under control. So much so that I didn't think to mention it to the instructors when they asked if anybody had any medical conditions, which could be of annoyance at the start. So much so that I didn't bring my inhaler. So much so, when somebody said that the reaction reeks, I took a huge whiff of it. Apparently sulfur dioxide is one of the few things which activates my asthma. I could not breathe and choked for long enough that I had to stop them from giving me medical attention. The moral of these stories is that I was a dumb child, I guess, and that you should wear PPE and not breathe in gases which you don't know how they will interact with your medical conditions. Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me before that someone working in a lab could have their asthma triggered. That's definitely a concern that hadn't gone through my mind before, and it's an interesting thing to think about. Generally, old and prestigious high schools are just great, heavy irony, in terms of labs. One girl I know goes to one of the best high schools in the whole of Poland, and definitely one of the best in my city. One day, she sent me pics of the chemical storage. They had some old dodgy solutions right near the students. I freaked out when I saw bromine and potassium dichromate solution in crusty bottles from the previous century. Closed not even with screw-on caps, but with non-greased glass stoppers. Old solutions should definitely be dealt with. That is super sketchy. I'm pretty sure everybody has a story of finding an old bottle of who knows what, which looks like it's absolutely deteriorating everywhere. One chemical like this that I've worked with was Woolen's reagent. It's a selenium analog to Lawson's reagent. And even if that thing was double sealed in a secondary container, I could still see red selenium creeping out of the container. So yeah, even if a chemical is stored, doesn't mean it's stored properly, and it doesn't mean that some fumes or vapors will eventually get out. It's even more concerning in this case that it's a high school, because those chemicals could be extremely old, and maybe the chemistry teacher doesn't even know what the chemicals are or what they would do. Not a chemist, but I work in our university's fabrication lab with a ton of substances that you do not want inside or outside of you. We have several Formlabs Form 2 resin printers, which require you to wash printed parts with 99.4% isopropyl alcohol and then cure it in a UV chamber before it can be considered safe to handle. In this case, curing just means that the monomer polymerizes. Some monomers can be initiated with UV. This is kind of like how dental fillings are done, for instance. It's normally pretty obvious what parts have and have not been washed, since they'll be covered, sometimes dripping with wet, toxic, uncured resin. One time, a trainee went to complete the post-processing for a customer order on the Form 2. In the worst breach of safety and general awareness that I've ever heard of, she raw-dogged the parts with ungloved hands and then threw them into the plastic pickup bag for an unwitting student to receive. No curing, no washing, and hands that looked like she had just dipped her fist into a jar of honey. She was promptly fired. That is so concerning. You should not be handling monomers with bare hands. Yikes. Right at the beginning of a lab, I heard one of my high school students say, "What's this?" Immediately afterwards, another girl made some angry noises and called for me. Girl 1 had found a barrel pipette in her lab drawer with a mystery liquid in it. She squeezed the bulb and shot it across the lab bench onto the shirt of Girl 2. Girl 2 told me what had happened and that she thought it was just water. I told her that we needed to treat it as if it were dangerous. Better safe than sorry. She wasn't soaked and said it wasn't on her skin, so I sent her and her friend to the locker room and told her to remove the shirt and anything else that might be affected, i.e. bra, but good luck keeping your job as a 40-year-old man telling a 16-year-old girl to take that off. Wash her skin with soap and water and put on a different shirt. She had a gym shirt there already, and only then worry about rinsing her shirt out. There was some eye rolling, but she was a good sport about it. However, it took a long time for her to return. She showed me the shirt, which had an irregular hole in it, the size of a deck of cards. I have absolutely no idea what was in the pipette or what the shirt was made of, but I'm glad that she took it seriously and that it really wasn't on her skin. I'll freely admit that I was guessing it was water. I never had trouble with those two groups wearing PPE for the rest of the year. A little higher and it would have been right in her face. This is super sketchy, and a thing people don't often think about when they're working in the lab is the material of the clothing that they're wearing. Some of these materials, for instance, if they're made of polyester, could easily dissolve in certain solvents, and something like base would just totally destroy them. I've seen people before working in labs where they accidentally get a bit of solvent on part of their bag or their clothes, and it just dissolves a massive hole, and you definitely don't want that. So I'm glad to hear that she took it seriously and wasn't negatively impacted. This is today's big story. I work in a natural products lab. We run column chromatography every day and use a lot of solvents, including chloroform. So I was distilling some impure chloroform and added 1 liter of old chloroform, maybe over 10 years old, to the distillation flask. The fume hood was on, so I didn't notice anything strange. After the distillation, I stored the chloroform in a 5-gallon jug. The next day, I was alone in the lab and opened the gallon outside of my fume hood, since the column was too big for it. I was hit by a strong sweet and acidic smell. It was like a punch to the face. I started coughing immediately and felt like my throat was on fire. I run out of the lab to breathe some fresh air in the emergency exit, still coughing and unable to breathe. When I recovered, I turned on a fan in the lab to get rid of the smell and sealed the gallon jug. On that day, I learned that chloroform can turn into Phosgene, a World War I chemical weapon, and I probably breathed some of it in. It didn't cause further consequences, and I learned to never use old chloroform again. This highlights the importance of knowing the risks of chemicals with prolonged storage. Chloroform forming Phosgene is one of those concerns. Another really common one is solvents that are ethereal, meaning they have an ether in them like tetrahydrofuran, 1,4-dioxane, or glyme, can readily form peroxides, and so distilling these can result in the concentration of those peroxides, and that can result in an explosion. In this case, they had the formation of Phosgene, which is another really sketchy thing, and so it highlights why you shouldn't necessarily use really old chemicals without knowing some of the hazards that could be present. Blacksmith here. I once attempted to make mokomegane with nickel and copper from quarters, basically Damascus nickel and copper. It turned out beautifully, and I made several projects out of it, but using quarters was expensive. So I tried to use nickels and pennies. Quarters are made from alloys of nickel with a copper core, whereas nickels and pennies are nickel and copper around a zinc core. I ended up inhaling tons of zinc oxide fumes and was bedridden with metal fume fever for 2 weeks. Some people don't know this, but certain metals can produce fumes that are really toxic for you to breathe in. So if you're ever doing metal work, make sure you do it in a well-ventilated area and avoid getting any lungfuls of metal vapor. Yes, I'm a simp, shielded in any situation by my PPE. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a great day.